What's your relationship with your siblings like? Close, distant, complicated?
Are you ready for a shocking truth? My parents told me my health was too expensive. 2 weeks later, they turned around and bought my brother a vacation home. That was the exact moment when every illusion I had about fairness, loyalty, and what family really meant shattered, and once that happened, there was no way back to the person I used to be. I had spent months preparing for a surgery that wasn't optional. My doctor had explained, patiently but firmly, that waiting too long would cause damage that could not be undone, and even with insurance covering part of the bill, I still needed thousands more to actually schedule it. I did the math over and over again, cut out everything I could from my own budget, and finally admitted to myself that I had no choice but to ask for help. I thought that was what families were for, that after years of me picking up slack in quiet ways, my parents would step up when it really mattered. When I sat down with them, I tried to keep it simple. I showed them the paperwork, the coverage letters, the out-of-pocket cost, and I said, this isn't cosmetic, it isn't optional, and it's going to get worse if I wait. My father leaned back like I was asking him to co-sign on a bad loan, not to help his daughter stay healthy. He said words that I will never forget. You need to learn personal responsibility. My mother, in her practiced, sympathetic voice, said, maybe wait and see. Sometimes these things improve on their own. I looked at both of them, wondering if they had actually listened to a single word I said, and realized they were already shutting the door before I had even finished the sentence. 2 weeks later, Ethan, my brother, posted a smiling video holding up champagne glasses with my parents standing proudly next to him. The caption read, "Our new place by the lake, time to make memories." My mother had already commented underneath, finally, a smart investment. I clicked through the photos and froze. I had once priced the exact countertop finish for fun, daydreaming about maybe affording it in another life. It was in their kitchen now. Their smiles in those pictures weren't forced or polite, they were glowing, bursting with pride at this purchase, while I was still juggling prescriptions and paperwork, wondering if my health would decline before I managed to pay the bill. That night I opened my bank account and pulled up every family expense I had quietly been covering for years. The shared phone plan that kept them at a cheaper rate, the streaming bundles they never thanked me for, the cloud storage that held their photos, even the emergency credit card I had left open after Dad's layoff a few years earlier. I stopped all of it in one night. I had been paying hundreds every month without ever being asked, thinking it made me a good daughter, thinking it made me safe in their good graces. But in reality, it only made me convenient. I remember the rush I felt when I redirected all that money into a separate account labeled only with one word, health. I scheduled the procedure the next morning. I didn't tell them. I didn't ask them. I just did it. The silence was heavy but liberating, like I had finally chosen myself over playing the role they wanted me to play. A few days later, while I was still recovering, I got a call from Aunt Laura. She's the one relative who has always been blunt, sometimes painfully so, but never wrong. She said, "I was going through your grandmother's papers, and you should see something I found. It has your name on it." Her voice carried weight, like she knew this would change everything. I asked what it was, but she only said, "Come over and look. It's better if you see it with your own eyes." That sentence replayed in my head all day, mixing with the image of Ethan clinking glasses in his vacation home and my parents beaming like he had won an Olympic medal. The anger that had burned quietly inside me for years suddenly had something sharp to hold on to. If my grandmother had left something meant for me, if there was proof that this wasn't just about favoritism or neglect, but about money that was deliberately redirected, then my parents hadn't just failed me, they had betrayed me. I stared at my phone that night, looking at the frozen smile of my mother in that photo, and thought, what if the truth is even worse than I imagined? And that's when everything really began. When I walked into Aunt Laura's house that afternoon, I thought she was going to show me some old family photos or maybe a handwritten letter from my grandmother that she had found tucked away in a box. But instead, she laid out copies of bank documents and notes written in my grandmother's unmistakable handwriting that mentioned me directly, alongside a small trust fund marked for medical necessity for grandchildren. I read the words twice before they really sank in, because it felt surreal that while my parents had been telling me that my health was too expensive, there had been money set aside for exactly that purpose. And my grandmother had even gone as far as to name me specifically as someone she wanted to make sure was taken care of. The shock turned into something heavier when I looked more closely at the account activity and saw the dates of withdrawals, which lined up almost perfectly with the closing costs on Ethan's vacation home. There it was in black and white. Money meant to cover medical expenses for grandchildren being funneled into countertops, new furniture, and even a warranty package for his property. It wasn't speculation. It wasn't family gossip. It was fact written across official statements that no one could argue with. For a moment, I actually felt physically sick, not just because of the betrayal, but because of the brazen way it was done, as if no one ever thought I would look closely enough to find out. I took copies with me, and the entire drive home I thought about every conversation I had ever had with my parents about responsibility, sacrifice, or fairness. Suddenly, their words weren't just hypocritical, they were manipulative, because while I was lying awake at night trying to figure out if I could afford the care that would keep me from long-term damage, they were happily pouring money into my brother's weekend escape. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I drafted a timeline that laid everything out in clean detail: my diagnosis, the insurance paperwork, the conversation where they refused to help, the exact day Ethan announced the new house, and the withdrawals from the trust that matched his so-called investment. The next morning, I called the bank's trust department. I didn't rage or accuse. I calmly asked procedural questions, requested a formal beneficiary inquiry, and filed it in writing so that there would be a record. I had worked in operations long enough to know that quiet, documented steps often had more power than shouting, so I put that skill to work in my own life for the first time. After that call, I contacted my doctor's office and requested all my medical records and insurance letters so that every piece of evidence was lined up. If there was going to be a fight, it would not be based on emotions or family drama, but on facts that couldn't be denied. Later that evening, I sent a short email to my parents, attaching the acknowledgement letter from the trust department and informing them that I had asked for verification of distributions. I didn't add emotion, I didn't explain, I didn't accuse. I just wrote, "Please direct all comments to the trustee." It was the coldest and clearest line I had ever written to them, and I knew immediately that it shifted the balance of power, because for once they couldn't smooth things over with charm or guilt. 2 hours later, my brother called me. He didn't even bother pretending he didn't know what was happening. His voice was sharp and angry, and he said, "If you freeze this, we will make sure you regret it." I let him finish, saved the voicemail, and said nothing in return, because I had already learned that silence often lands harder than arguments. His threat told me everything I needed to know. He was scared, because he understood that if the trustee confirmed misuse, it would not just be an embarrassing mistake. It could have real consequences that touched every corner of the image my parents had worked so hard to protect. That night I sat at my kitchen table with the documents spread out in front of me. On one side was my grandmother's handwriting, proof that she had thought of me and wanted to make sure I would never go without essential care. On the other side were withdrawals that showed my parents had ignored that wish and chosen instead to secure a luxury property for my brother. The contrast was so stark that it almost felt staged, as if someone had drawn a line in the sand and dared me to decide which side I was on. I knew then that this wasn't just about money anymore. This was about truth, about exposing the way they had played favorites and manipulated narratives for years, about finally refusing to let their version of events go unchallenged. For once, I had evidence that didn't rely on memory or perspective. It was indisputable. And I was ready to use it, even if it meant burning bridges I once thought I could never cross. When I went to bed that night, my phone buzzed again, but I didn't even check the message. I lay there thinking about how quickly the ground had shifted, how I had gone from begging them for help to holding proof that could unravel everything they had built around Ethan. The balance of power wasn't in their hands anymore, and I knew exactly what I was going to do next. Because if they thought my health was too expensive, they were about to find out how costly betrayal could really become. I woke up the next morning with the kind of clarity that usually arrives only after you finally stop arguing with yourself. And because I had the timeline, the trust correspondence, and my medical paperwork already organized, I decided it was time to move the conversation out of our living room and into spaces where people actually read what is put in front of them and respond according to rules rather than moods. So I drafted a plain, factual summary that laid out every step in order, attached the documents that mattered, and sent it to the trustee as an official addendum to my inquiry, copying Aunt Laura as my witness and copying no one else, because I wanted the right eyes on it, and I wanted the wrong people to feel, for once, that the room had gone quiet on them. My phone lit up with my mother's name before lunchtime, and I answered because I wanted to hear her version while recording the call through the automated disclosure message I use for work training, which she accepted without thinking. And she launched straight into the speech I expected, the one about family unity and private matters, and how we should not let outsiders judge us, because outsiders do not understand context, and how I was hurting my father's chances at a local board appointment. Because these things have background checks and people talk. To which I responded slowly and clearly that the trustee is not an outsider, and that I will not treat my health like a family reputation problem that we can wallpaper over with a group photo and a holiday toast. And after a long pause, she said the line that told me everything about where this was going, which was that I had always been too literal and that life required flexibility, especially in families, and I realized she was describing theft as flexibility without even hearing herself. In the afternoon, my father called with the voice he uses when he thinks he is being reasonable, but is actually pushing boundaries, and he said I was weaponizing paperwork and turning a misunderstanding into a scandal. And I told him that paperwork exists so that misunderstandings do not become theft, and that if everything was as innocent as he claimed, then the trustee's review would end this quickly and cleanly, which caused a silence I had never heard from him, the kind where the person knows the playbook is not working and is already thinking about the next angle, and because I was done being the daughter who rushes in to soften the edges, I said I needed to hop off and that any further comments should be in writing to the trustee. And then I hung up and felt the adrenaline finally slow. That evening I drove to a restaurant where we had a long-standing habit of family dinners, a habit I had kept up even when I felt like part of a stage set, and when the check came my mother made the familiar gesture toward me that she always made. A small slide of the leather folder like I was the dependable bookend in their carefully arranged life, and I placed the folder back in front of her and said, in a voice that surprised even me with how steady it was, that my health comes first and image comes last, and then I stood up, put on my coat, and left before dessert. Not because I needed a dramatic exit, but because I needed the pattern to break in a way that my body could feel and remember the next time I was tempted to hold the whole thing together for everyone else. When I got home, I opened my laptop and went to work on the one pressure point I knew had nothing to do with family politics and everything to do with rules, which was the homeowners association for Ethan's new property, because the listing photos were public. The booking calendar was public, and the short-term rental restrictions were printed on a page that anyone could access, so I compiled the dates that matched the trust withdrawals, cross-referenced them with the nights he had renters in the house, and wrote a short, neutral report that included only links, screenshots, and the relevant rule sections, and I submitted it through the compliance portal without one extra word of commentary. Because the best part about rules is that they do not care about charm. The response landed in Ethan's inbox within a day, which he forwarded to our family group chat with a flurry of dramatic lines about betrayal and jealousy and how I was trying to ruin his success, to which I did not respond, because the notice spoke for itself, listing potential fines, a hearing date, and a warning that further violations could result in penalties that would make his weekend business model crumble. And I sat there and realized that for the first time in years I was not the one scrambling, I was not the one explaining, and I was not the one carrying the invisible cost of everyone else's choices. My mother tried again, this time switching to a softer approach, raising the idea of a family statement where I would acknowledge that I had misunderstood the intent of the fund and that all of us were committed to moving forward together. which she said would protect Dad's appointment and calm the gossip among her charity friends, and she promised that if I did that, we could work something out quietly to help with my medical bills, but I had moved past the point where vague promises had any currency, so I told her that any help would need to be structured as a repayment into a health account with dates and amounts, along with a simple signed note acknowledging the fund's purpose as written by Grandma. And that until then I would not be part of a statement that turned theft into a misunderstanding. That night I printed a one-page document with clear terms and a reasonable timeline, and I placed it on my desk next to two sealed envelopes I had prepared but not yet mailed. One addressed to the board liaison handling my father's appointment with copies of the relevant documents and dates, and the other addressed to the compliance officer at my mother's charity with the same clean timeline. And I looked at those envelopes and understood the power of patience, which is not passivity but the discipline to let people choose their own consequences, and I gave them 48 hours to sign the repayment agreement before I dropped the envelopes in a mailbox. I went to bed feeling more calm than I had in weeks, but before I fell asleep my phone buzzed with a voicemail from my brother that I decided to listen to in the morning, and when I finally played it over coffee, his voice had shifted from anger to panic as he said that the association had flagged new bookings and that the trustee had frozen distributions pending review, and his last sentence was the most honest thing he has ever said to me, that if this kept going our parents would lose the one thing they valued more than money, which was the image they had built piece by piece over years of carefully edited stories, and as I hit save, the screen lit with my mother's number again, and I knew exactly how far I was willing to go. Because the envelopes were waiting, the deadline was clear, and the next move was theirs until it wasn't. By the time the trustee confirmed in writing that distributions from the fund were under formal review, the atmosphere in my family had shifted from uneasy tension to something closer to open warfare disguised as polite conversation. And I understood that this was the moment to stop reacting to their chaos and start setting terms so clear that there would be no room for another round of manipulation. The freeze on the account meant that my brother's cash flow was suddenly restricted. The Homeowners Association had already scheduled a hearing for the violations I documented, and both of my parents were more concerned about what this would look like in public than about the fact that their daughter had been left without support for a medically necessary procedure, which told me everything I needed to know about their priorities. My father called one night with a tone that tried to sound casual, as though nothing serious was happening, and he said that these things were best handled privately and that escalating to outside parties would embarrass us all. A phrase I had heard my entire life whenever something inconvenient threatened the carefully maintained image they presented. I told him plainly that this wasn't about embarrassment, it was about accountability, and that unless a repayment plan was signed and money was placed into a health account in my name, the documents would go to the appropriate organizations. He accused me of blackmail, and I reminded him that blackmail requires a threat to reveal something untrue, while what I held in my hands was simply the truth written in signatures and bank statements. The silence that followed was long enough that I could hear him breathing heavily before he muttered something about family loyalty and hung up. My mother tried a softer angle the next day, calling me in the morning as if she had been awake all night rehearsing her lines, and she pleaded that I think of Dad's board appointment, how much it meant to him, how it would give him dignity after years of career disappointments, and how exposing all of this would ruin his chance to finally be recognized. I listened quietly, and when she finished, I told her that dignity is not built on stolen money and that if he wanted recognition, perhaps it should come from what he earned honestly instead of what he covered up. Her tone shifted instantly from pleading to sharpness, and she said, "If you do this, you will not have a family anymore." I saved the voicemail as soon as she hung up, because I realized in that moment that the words were not a threat but a confession. She was acknowledging that family, in their definition, existed only when I played the part they needed, and that the moment I demanded fairness, they were willing to cut me off to protect themselves. That evening I sat at my desk and drafted what I called, at least privately, the care contract. It was one page, unemotional, stripped of all decoration, just numbers and dates and signatures. The repayment plan was modest, structured to cover the money diverted from the trust over time, and every dollar would go into an account designated for medical care. I added a single line at the bottom that required them to acknowledge in writing that the fund was established for grandchildren's medical necessity as written by my grandmother. It was not dramatic, it was not cruel, it was not vindictive, it was practical, and it was the bare minimum they owed. I emailed it to them with a deadline 48 hours away, and in the same message I wrote that if they refused, the documentation would be forwarded to the trustee, the board liaison, and the compliance officer at Mom's charity. On my desk, 2 sealed envelopes sat like anchors holding the plan in place. One contained the full packet prepared for the board liaison, complete with dates of trust withdrawals and the paperwork showing they overlapped with Ethan's property purchases, and the other contained the same packet addressed to the compliance officer at Mom's charity, whose bylaws explicitly required transparency and honesty in personal dealings. Both envelopes were ready to be mailed at the expiration of the deadline, and just seeing them there reminded me that, for once, the power did not sit with them. Over the next 2 days the calls multiplied, with Ethan leaving angry messages about how I was ruining his life, my father trying to frame me as vindictive and unstable, and my mother shifting between begging and threats. But I refused to answer except to reply by text. Please see the care contract. Deadline remains. The simplicity of the reply infuriated them more than any argument could have, because it was a reminder that I was not moving the goalposts or getting lost in emotional detours. The terms were fixed, the clock was running, and I was not bending. The night before the deadline, my brother left me one last voicemail that almost made me laugh, though the sound was bitter. He said that if the envelopes were sent, they would make sure the whole family knows what kind of person you really are, as if exposing me for asking for fairness would somehow tarnish me instead of them. I hit save again and thought about how predictable it all was, the threats, the guilt, the shifting blame. They had relied on those tactics for decades, and they had worked until now. As midnight passed and the deadline approached, I felt a strange calm settle over me, because I knew that whatever happened next was no longer up to me. Either they would sign the contract and finally, however reluctantly, acknowledge the truth, or they would refuse and face the consequences I had carefully prepared. For the first time, I felt like I had built something solid under my feet, something that did not sway when they shouted or whispered or cried. When I finally turned off the light and lay down, I checked my phone one last time and saw that my mother had left another voicemail. I pressed play, and her voice was trembling but deliberate. If you do this, you will not have a family. I replayed it once, saved it, and put the phone face down, because I understood that the real family I wanted was not the one defined by threats, conditions, or stolen promises, but the one I was building with boundaries, evidence, and the kind of self-respect that had been missing for far too long. The envelopes were still on my desk, the contract was still unsigned, and the deadline was almost here, but I already knew I would not hesitate when the moment came, because this time it would be me setting the cost, and them deciding if they were willing to pay it. The 48-hour deadline came and went without a single signature, and although I cannot say I was surprised, the absence of any willingness to take responsibility still landed like confirmation of a truth I had already begun to accept. That my parents would rather risk exposure, humiliation, and the slow collapse of their carefully polished image than admit they had betrayed the intention of my grandmother and sacrificed my health for my brother's luxury. I looked at the unsigned contract on my desk, placed it in the drawer with the other documents, and picked up the 2 sealed envelopes I had prepared. I did not tremble, I did not hesitate, and I did not linger over what might happen next. I simply walked to the mailbox, slid them in, and turned the key with a click that felt like closing a door on years of manipulation. Within 3 days, the first ripple arrived. The trustees sent me a preliminary report acknowledging that the disbursements had been used for expenses outside the scope of medical necessity, and that unless corrected through repayment, the matter would escalate into a formal finding with possible recovery action. It was written in the dry, legal tone of compliance, but to me, every line was like oxygen, because it meant that my version of reality was no longer just words spoken into the void. It was backed by the authority of a system that still respected truth over performance. At nearly the same time, my brother received notice from the Homeowners Association that the fines for unauthorized short-term rentals were now formally assessed, with the hearing date confirmed and the warning that further violations could result in suspension of property privileges. His angry texts rolled in, calling me vindictive, jealous, and cruel, but the louder he shouted, the more obvious it became that he understood exactly what had happened. He was being forced to deal with the consequences of actions he had always assumed someone else would clean up. The blow that truly shifted the ground, however, came when my father's board liaison sent a polite but unmistakable email announcing that he would be stepping back from consideration due to circumstances that had come to light regarding financial stewardship. The wording was clean and careful, but I recognized the subtext immediately. The documents I sent had landed, had been read, and had forced the hand of people who valued integrity, at least on paper. My father did not call me after that email. Instead, he sent one line through my mother's phone, saying, "I hope you're proud." I read it twice, and instead of guilt, I felt relief, because for once the consequence was his to carry, not mine to absorb. My mother's charity followed a few days later with an acknowledgement that they had received my packet and would be reviewing it in accordance with their code of ethics. The tone was professional, not sympathetic, and that was exactly what I wanted. No one was patting me on the head for being brave. No one was telling me I was dramatic. No one was minimizing what had been done. They were treating it as serious, because it was serious, and that alone felt like validation after years of being told to be flexible or not make waves. For weeks afterward, I kept my phone on silent because I knew the messages that would arrive were not for me but for the version of me they used to control, the daughter who picked up bills quietly, smoothed arguments, and carried responsibility without acknowledgement. When I finally scrolled through, the pattern was predictable: Ethan calling me names, my mother alternating between begging and threatening, my father refusing to speak in full sentences, as if words themselves now felt dangerous to him. I responded only once, through an attorney, with a simple email stating that all communication regarding repayment should be in writing, directed to the trustee, and that any personal contact outside of those terms would not be acknowledged. It was not cruel, it was not angry, it was simply the boundary I had built brick by brick. Then one morning, without warning, a wire transfer appeared in the health account I had opened. The description read only repayment 1. There was no apology, no note, no explanation, just money finally moving where it had been meant to go from the beginning. I sat at the kitchen table staring at the confirmation on the screen, and I realized that I did not need the words I used to crave, the ones that said, "We are sorry," or "We understand." What I needed was proof that I was no longer carrying their burden, and in that moment, I had it. I scheduled the rest of my procedure immediately, paying in full without waiting for anyone's approval. For the first time in years, my health was secured not by begging or bargaining, but by my own insistence that I was worth the cost. It felt both anticlimactic and extraordinary, because the victory was not loud or cinematic. It was simply the quiet shift of power back into my hands. Weeks passed, and the calls slowed, though the silence they left behind carried its own weight. Friends asked if I missed them, if I wanted reconciliation, if I thought one day we might sit together again at a table as though nothing had happened. I told the truth. They say they cannot understand why I cut them off, but I think they do, and if they really don't, then that is not my emergency anymore. When I look back now, the clearest moment in the entire story is not the discovery of the documents, not the trustee's report, not the fines or the board withdrawal, not even the repayment. It is the moment I pulled every family expense I had been covering and redirected it into my health account, because that was the first time I acted as if my life was worth more than their approval. Every step after that was simply the echo of a decision I had already made, and no matter how many times they tried to rewrite the story, the truth remained. They chose a vacation home over my health, and I chose myself over their control. The envelopes were sent, the money is moving, and the silence between us now is permanent in a way that no family holiday or shared photo could ever fix, but that is not my loss. Because what I finally gained was the one thing they always told me was too expensive, a future on my own terms.